Boeing's woes continue for yet another week. The aviation giant found itself under scrutiny with 2 consecutive court hearings on Capitol Hill. In the first hearing, aviation experts testified before Congress to address Boeing's safety issues. The second hearing featured a whistleblower alleging that Boeing hurried production, resulting in improperly bonded fuselage sections. A tale of 2 airline results this morning. Southwest shares plunging after saying it now expects to get 20 737 MAX 8 planes from Boeing in 2024. That's down from the previous 46 that they anticipated. The airline also saying that they expect revenue to grow in the high single digits for 2024. That is lower than the previous expectations of double-digit growth. You're taking a look at shares right now. They were down pre-market here by about 8% ahead of the trade, and we're continuing to watch that very closely. I think going forward here, and it comes back to actually something that we spoke with Delta CEO Ed Bastian about, and they had a profitable quarter, Delta did, and he made this statement when I spoke with him about this most recent earnings period and what he anticipated from the rest of the airline industry. Let's play that real quick.
Well, that's the reason we were able to generate the profit in the first quarter. We expect we'll be the only, if you believe the analysts, the only airline that's profitable, only major airline that's profitable in the first quarter.
So #Ed was right. And at the end of the day, I think it really comes back to a few things. Number one, it's the corporate travel, and the margins that continues to provide Delta versus some of the other competitors out there, where that is ultimately benefiting them. And then additionally, it is the aircraft capacity as well, and how that's impacting capacity versus where they were expecting to take delivery for some of the other major airlines we've heard from.
Yeah, and Bob Jordan in this earnings release saying that he cited significant challenges this year and next on those reduced deliveries here from Boeing. We talk about the impact that is having on United. We talked about the impact that's having on a number of the larger airlines here. Obviously, like you were just talking about, so clearly this is the latest. Southwest citing that as a huge issue and something that's going to restrict revenue here, at least for the immediate future.
Talk a little shares of Boeing, ticker symbol BA, reversing some earlier gains after the company reported Q1 results. The report closely watched as it comes just a few months after a door plug blowout on an Alaska Airlines Boeing 737 MAX 9 jet. The airplane manufacturer blew through $3.9 billion in cash in the first quarter. This was less dramatic than analysts' expectations of as much as $4.5 billion. Manufacturers saying that these results reflect lower commercial delivery volume. So for much more on the results and how air travelers will be affected, we've got Yahoo Finance's Shauna Smith. Hey, Shauna.
Hey there, Brad. Well, it's all about that delivery number that you just mentioned, and that's really going to trickle down to the consumer because a drop in deliveries, well, it means that airlines, they might be left scrambling to meet that demand, and fewer flights could translate into higher ticket prices, and you could be paying more for your next trip. So let's break all of this down. When it comes to what we just heard from Boeing, Boeing delivered 83 planes here, their most recent quarter. Now that's down about 36% from the numbers that we saw a year ago. And drilling down further into that 737 line, well, deliveries there plunging 40% on a year-over-year basis. When the company's earnings release here, Boeing CEO Dave Calhoun writing, quote, "Our first quarter results reflect the immediate actions that we've taken to slow down 737 production to drive improvements in quality." Well, United, Alaska Air, and Delta all mentioning the impact of Boeing's delayed deliveries in their most recent earnings results. United now expects a total of just 61 narrow-body aircraft deliveries this year. That's down more than 30% from their initial projections of 101 here to start the year. And Alaska Air now expects to receive between 10 and 20 Boeing planes, down from its initial expectation of 23. And Delta CEO Ed Bastian, well, he told investors last month that he expects 737 MAX 10 jet deliveries to actually be pushed out to as late as 2027. So you have a number of those big airline executives warning about a drop in deliveries, and that results in reduced flight capacity, all of which could affect pricing, especially this summer when we are expecting to see yet another record-setting travel season. Well, we talked to Morningstar's Nick Owens recently, and he weighed in about the prospect of higher prices for consumers as a result of deliveries. Let's take a listen.
It will be, I think, another year and a half before Boeing gets a go-ahead to produce some more 737s. And so I think you'll see a kind of plane shortage story unwinding. So they'll be using older planes a little bit longer, and so on and so forth. And just generally not being able to grow the capacity quite as fast as they had originally hoped. You saw some talk in the announcement here about reshuffling their order book and so on, and other airlines are doing that too.
Right.
So what I'm driving at is slightly less growth in capacity, and as long as we still have this resurgent post-COVID travel demand, that just means prices will go up.
So let's take a look at where airfare prices are today, because the latest inflation data is showing that airline fares have at least fallen on a month-over-month basis, drop of 0.4% on a year-over-year basis, or actually off 7%. But when we talk about some of that relief that we have seen, well, it might be short-lived if some of those projections from analysts like Nick Owens come true here. And Brad, when you and I were speaking with him last week, he was saying that 250, it's now the new 400, right? You have to be ready to pay $400 if you're going on what had cost you $250 not too long ago. That's going to be a tough pill to swallow here for many of Americans who are looking to get out and travel. But if they have to pay that much more for airfare, then that clearly can be problematic this travel season.
Yeah, that's where Avis, Hertz, Enterprise, and AAA would say, well, you could just drive if you want to. Of course, that's always their reminder. Shauna, thanks so much for breaking this down, all things airfare. Well, so far, the street has mostly brushed off the aerospace giant's struggles, with over 60% of analysts covering the company holding a buy rating on the stock. Our next guest is one of those analysts. We've got Bert Subin, who is the Stifel Senior Research Analyst. Bert, great to see you here with us this morning. First, foremost, let's just get broad stroke, your takeaway from this Boeing report.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me back, and I think you gave a pretty good synopsis there. The first quarter earnings, I think, were always going to be relatively unimportant. There was so much disruption in the first quarter. You had the cash compensation that's going to United, Alaska, and others. You're producing aircraft at a very, very low rate, and making a lot of changes to ultimately get your arms around quality. And so there were a lot of costs absorbed in the first quarter. Like you noted, free cash was a little better, so that was encouraging. I think that was probably the highlight. And I think part of that was BDS driven, so the defense business was better than expected. And BGS, which is the services and aftermarket business, was also quite a bit better than expected. And so that combo helped. The commercial airplane business, continues to struggle. But I think we heard some encouraging remarks from Dave Calhoun this morning. The company's still looking to draw down its inventory this year, which is good. They're still planning to acquire Spirit potentially this quarter, which is, I think, a positive. And they're sticking by their $10 billion free cash target in 26, which is surprising. But I think it, speaks to their confidence in the ability to right the ship. So certainly some investor skepticism there, but I think they're saying, a lot of the right things this morning.
Bert, you mentioned that the acquisition of Spirit AeroSystems you view as a positive. Why? What is it going to do to the business in the long term?
Yeah, I think people maybe think of it differently. If you're looking at this as a typical deal, where is this going to be accretive, or how much is this going to reduce capital intensity or things like that, you wouldn't like this deal. But the reality is, Boeing's number one issue has been sort of getting its arms around, quality and its supply chain, and Spirit is a huge part of that. And there have been quality lapses in recent years. And so by acquiring Spirit, you can better integrate, and to a degree, vertically integrate their supply chain and give the customers and the regulators greater confidence that you're going to produce the highest quality product every time. And so from that perspective, I think it's really important for reputation and for sort of showing, an actionable step toward, improving the business. And so Spirit is not a small company, but relative to Boeing, it is pretty small, right? The enterprise value is somewhere circa 5-ish% of the total Boeing value. And so it's not something they couldn't digest. And I think, down the road, there could be positives for margin accretion, but that's certainly not the focus near term.
Bert, at what price is Boeing paying too much for Spirit AeroSystems? I mean, the stock rose for Spirit AeroSystems by about, 15% after the kind of rumor mill was running and the talks of the deal started to emerge there. But at what price are they paying too much?
It's a great question. I think there's a wide dispersion of people's expectations here. We've said $34. The stock was trading around 28 and change before the announcement. That would represent sort of north of 20% upside, which would seem like a reasonable premium considering a lot of the cash headwinds that Spirit has and a lot of the advances that's taken on from Boeing and Airbus. I think the reality is it's probably not going to be that simple because this would assume that Boeing just goes out and buys Spirit. And what it seems to be the case is that they're probably going to divest Airbus assets and perhaps some defense programs and then buy sort of the remaining piece. And so that creates a lot of complexity for assessing that. But if you're just looking at it on a total basis, we've sort of viewed 34 as reasonable, which, slightly ahead of where it is today.
Yeah, certainly. Trading right now at about $32.50 here per share. Just lastly, let's go to Paris, if you will, the Paris Air Show. If Boeing does not have a standout performance at this Paris Air Show, which is coming at about the end of the quarter in June, then what for the rest of the year? What does that signal for the outlook from your perspective?
So orders have been pretty good to start the year, right? I mean, the backlog is at record levels. They were able to book a big American order, the 787, I think is gaining a little bit of traction as well. So this summer we'll have Farnborough. Paris is every 2 years. So we'll have Farnborough in July. And I think that'll be an opportunity for Boeing to get out there, particularly if they're starting to improve or sort of communicate that improvement to customers, could be an opportunity for them to start selling more Maxes again, which has, been something that, we've seen little fits and starts, but, that would be an opportunity if they can show customers that, they're getting back on track, could be an opportunity to pull in some more orders, which would be important because you get the advances, the free cash, and then, you could sort of see the reputational concerns starting to ease.
Bert, you are right. It is in 2025. And guess what? I'm going to be updating my calendar after we hop off. Bert Subin, who's the Stifel Senior Research Analyst. Bert, thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you.
Brutal start to the year for Boeing. All lead to its first quarter results, which were not as dramatically bad as the street expected. The plane maker beat estimates on its top and bottom line, even as it faced pressures from consumers and regulators after the door blew out on the Alaska Airlines MAX 9 flight back in January. But let's dive a bit deeper into three key figures from these results, starting with that adjusted free cash flow number here. Now, ultimately, Boeing saw negative $3.9 billion in its first quarter. That's lower than the negative $4.5 billion that analysts were expecting. That's your first point of relief. And then commercial airplanes revenue, a big miss there. Boeing saw $4.65 billion. The estimate was looking for, north of $5 billion, actually closer to $5.5 billion to come in there. And of course, it's important to remember that there's really only two big players in that space. It's Boeing and it's Airbus for the large plane orders on the commercial side here. And then finally, we've got to talk about that backlog growing once again to $529 billion or 5,600 commercial airplanes. And here's why that matters. Now you've got airline operators who are expected to take delivery and ultimately be able to infuse that into their own route schedules. They're not able to do that, at least in this interim or near-term period of time, at the cadence that they were expecting. So now for you, the customer, and perhaps the investor, that means rejiggering some of your calculations on how much the customer is willing to pay, how much routes and how many routes that these airlines are still going to be able to fly, and when Boeing is actually going to be able to deliver them, and at what cost. It's probably going to mean that they might have to acquire a little bit more here. And Spirit AeroSystems, one of the major companies that Boeing may need to go after, especially coming off of a major quality assurance day that they shut down operations for in order to make sure that they could get a better handle on where some of the gaps in their overall operation and system were and remove even more of that pattern of negligence that became apparent in the 2018 and 2019 crashes, which also involved the MAX.
Boeing blew through $3.9 billion in cash in the first quarter, but it was better than the $4.4 billion that analysts estimated. Questions still circle around the embattled airplane manufacturer, including production quality, the search for a new CEO. Here to help us break it all down is Robert Spingarn, Managing Director of Aerospace Defense and Space at Melius Research. Thanks for being here, Robert. So when we look, it's interesting because initially there was a bit more of a positive reaction when it came to Boeing, maybe a little bit of relief. And then we saw that fade. What do you think sort of took over here? Just that the road is still going to be tough for Boeing?
Yeah, that's really all it is. I think people were long into the quarter expecting some positive news. The CEO gave a pretty positive, upbeat interview on television this morning before the earnings call. And then you get into the details in the earnings call and you see it's perhaps a little bit more complex a recovery story than it looked earlier in the day.
And Rob, it sounds like they're standing by their free cash flow target, $10 billion by 2026. Did that surprise you, Rob? They're going to stick by that bogey?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, we reduced our number roughly a month ago. Think that they're that's a bit of a stretch to get to that 10 billion in 2026. The CEO said he thinks they can do it. The CFO, interestingly, suggested, at least to me, that maybe they hit that run rate toward the end of the year in 26, so maybe a little bit later. But there's, they got to chop a lot of wood to get there.
Talk us through some of that chopping, right? I mean, we know a lot of the challenges that are in front of Boeing right now. What do you think is sort of most urgent and important for the company to accomplish this year, besides, finding a new guy to run the thing, or woman?
Well, so there is that. But the two most important things are the 737 and 787 production rates. Those are the two cash cows in the commercial airplane business, and they need to stabilize those aircraft programs and raise those rates to generate cash. So again, the two cash cows. Then they have to improve the defense business. And that did come in a little better than expected today. So that was one of the positives. But it's still a negative cash flow business, and it's got to swing to positive by 2026 in order to hit that $10 billion number.
And Rob, I don't think I've had the chance to get your take on the Spirit acquisition either. In your opinion, smart move, Rob, positive for the business?
I think it's kind of inconsequential. We've taken the view that Boeing has wielded a lot of influence at Spirit since the spin nearly 20 years ago. They've had people in those factories for a couple of decades. They can ask Spirit to do the things they need them to do. So I don't think it's necessary that they have to own Spirit in order to get it to improve better. Yes, they can put them on common systems and so on, but they have plenty of access to Spirit the whole time. What really needs to happen is both Spirit and Boeing have to improve their operations, and they can do that separately or together.
What does the regulatory landscape look like right now for Boeing? What's still to come in terms of, consequences or new regulations put on the company?
Well, that's a little bit of an unknown. They're still under scrutiny for the tragic accidents that happened a few years back, and that is now being revisited. Some of the families are asking the government to reopen investigations, and we don't know how that will play out. We don't know if this incident with Alaska Air 1282 allows for the reopening of the deferred prosecution agreement from a few years ago. And then the other side of this is the FAA is simply going to mandate a certain level of increased scrutiny and oversight over Boeing's operations. And going forward, I'd like to think that scrutiny oversight will be consistent. It makes the environment, the industry safer for everybody. Boeing will adapt to it, so will the other aerospace companies, and that's a good thing.
And Rob, in terms of just kind of events coming up on the calendar, you do have that Farnborough Air Show, Rob, coming up. I think it's July. Is that important for Boeing at all?
Historically, the air shows, Farnborough in July and then alternating with Paris in June the next year, have been a great place for orders to materialize and for industry to get together. It's really about orders. That's been less important, I'd say, over the last decade. Having said that, though, because COVID canceled a couple of those shows, the last Paris Air Show was a big deal. Farnborough could be a big deal for orders this year, but I would say that that's more of a side event. Where the focus is going, the scrutiny is going to be at this point, where Boeing is concerned, is on getting those aircraft production rates stabilized and then raising them.
And so, Rob, maybe you're leading to my last question for you. You have a hold on the name, so you're on the sidelines. I was just going to ask you, Rob, what kind of you're looking for? What would it take to get you more bullish on Boeing?
Well, exactly that. I want to see evidence that they've really got their arms around these production rates and that they can raise them sustainably. There's been a lot of volatility month to month, quarter to quarter. We need to see these rates stabilized on an annual basis and the ability to move those up over the next couple of years toward those targets. And once we see that, we can get constructive. At the same time, we need to see improvement in the defense business, debt retired. And the other thing, I haven't mentioned it yet, we really do think the company needs to think about its next airplane. It is losing ground to Airbus. The longer that they wait to start a new aircraft, and that does preserve cash flow, but there's two sides to this coin. The longer that they wait to start on a new airplane, the more ground they potentially lose later on in the next decade.
Interesting. And they've obviously, to your point before, they've got a lot to do before they can get to that new plane. Rob, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Pleasure.